Hello everyone, today we talk about the political and administrative structuring of the Iberian monarchies during the 14th and 15th century. So, the late medieval history of the four Iberian kingdoms of Castile and Leon, Portugal, Navarre, and Catalonia-Aragon share not just a few general tendencies during the 14th and 15th century that are worth to briefly remember. The strengthening of the central and territorial administrative structures, the formations of official group of professionals at the service of the respective monarchies, the dialogue between kingdom and political society, we can say, through the development of representative assemblies. Also, the centrality of the nobility, even within its deep transformations, and also the political weight, the growing political weight of the urban elites. Naturally, these phenomena are in part similar to other areas of Europe, but naturally the Iberian Peninsula has its own particular environment, let's say, but from a political point of view, it has actually a lot of diversity within it. Just look at these kingdoms, and they're objectively very different in their stories, in spite of the points of continuity. This is mostly evident with the major ones, Castile and Aragon, that had kind of even different geographical orientation and different social and institutional forms that we will take a look at here. And naturally, we can't take into consideration these last 2 centuries of the Middle Ages without thinking about how what these Iberian kingdoms were coming from previously. And yet, it's important, in my opinion, to insist on the certain at least peculiar characteristics, right? So these societies were born out of the Reconquista, right, with a aggressive local rooting. This is very important. Like the Iberian Peninsula had been in many ways in the Christian-Muslim frontier heavily militarized, and this also changed sometimes the forms of production, the landscape in some ways. Think about Castile in itself, what it literally means as a land full of castles, were wide areas that had also remained depopulated because they saw this constant warfare. At the beginning of the 13th century, basically the Christians managed to push finally relegate to the south the Muslim power, but Muslim power is going to remain there up to 1492, simply because these Christian monarchies are now revolving actually within their own internal structuration and also fighting against themselves. So it was really a matter of territorial redrawing of many spaces that you don't find in other areas of Europe. In other areas of Europe, maybe just in certain areas of the Baltic, you find territories that hadn't had, let's say, a political and territorial continuity, political domination, that have in areas that where these dominations had yet to be formed. The Iberian Peninsula was very different, also because historically the south was the most advanced areas. So the Christian monarchies of the north progressively came to restructure, in part, the local government on different bases, naturally relying also on what existed before, and but posing themselves the problem of creating, let's say, effectively new states. This is the real point of the story. Here we are in the 14th and 15th century. Here it's not just about substituting to another power. It's like the Muslims had done. The Muslims had these waves of dynasties in the south that had come effectively to rule always around the Andalusian area. Here, in part, naturally, with Castile, these territories are encompassed by the Castilians, but the center of power is shifted somewhere else, and it's built, is structured somewhere else. And in a moment in which definitely other monarchies, other powers, just like the Christians and the Muslims alike, were evolving towards a form of that also medieval history hadn't quite seen. Even the Muslims that technically from the early Middle Ages in southern Spain had like a centralized state as such. Now after the 11th century had gone fragmented, pulverized, let's say, politically into the typhus, etc., which allowed in part also to this to the Reconquista itself, right? And there are naturally other factors. We haven't discussed enormously the Reconquista, but one day you have to do it because it's really, really fascinating. But what I would like to leave you with today in this video is making you realize how effective, in many ways, the Iberian monarchies were in re-establishing in establishing a state in the first place out of areas where this hadn't existed. This is not to be given for granted, especially considering the overall instability that objectively existed especially from a dynastic point of view, but also in certain situations, as we will see today, with communities that weren't so easily frameable under central power, especially in Aragon, and that yet managed to bring not just to the creation of these states, but also to their dynastic unification at the end of the 15th century, which will change European history forever and will produce in turn one of the greatest powers, in fact, of early medieval Europe, and that expanded also outside of Spain. In fact, we should consider here that when we talk about powers like Aragon, we're talking about even the vice kingdoms in Sicily, for example, later on in Naples, the domination over Sardinia. So an expansion that had taken even certain peculiar forms that would be interesting to investigate, also because there was not such a close union between these dynasties. Sometimes you look at Aragon saying, oh, well, these guys basically control the whole thing. Well, if you look at the Aragonese policy during the 13th to 14th century, you realize that, yeah, the fact that it ruled on Sicily in Aragon, it doesn't mean that it was much of a a cooperation after all. I mean, generally speaking, yes, there were certain political dynamics that brought Aragon, generally speaking, to take a certain side, usually the Ghibelline one, initially, but there was no institutional continuity. Yet, from Aragon, these guys effectively controlled these other areas and progressively began to kind of implement the local administration governments also in these extra Iberian lands. So we will not focus on that specifically. Today we talk about, geographically speaking, about the Iberian Peninsula fundamentally, and Balearic Islands, and this broader, in fact, properly Iberian space. Maybe we will not focus particularly on Portugal, but especially on the bigger chunks of Castile and Aragon. But still, there are certain elements in common you can see also elsewhere. Definitely, when you look at the Reconquista itself, you look at this essentially very different forms of territorial reorganization, right? It could be either seigneurial, military, meaning literally knights or military orders, or urban of the domination, which had been for a long time the founding element of political power. So the Iberian monarchies had reached by the end of the 13th century this precarious balance, internal balance between the nobility, the monarchy, and the urban elites, fundamentally in this space. So this was founded, at the time, fundamentally on customary law, and this local laws and legal systems in general that were thought to be a prerogative of local communities, and it was very hard after this great wave of conquest during the 13th century to regulate that. So there is actually a very important dynamic in here that also explains why effectively the Muslim South also was maintained for so long afterwards, because these states had been born from non-previous, in fact, statal polities, we can say, but had acquired an immense amount of land. The Iberian Peninsula is pretty damn large, right? It's today, considering Portugal as well, and Spain together, they're larger than France, right? So it's massive. It's also very diverse. Like, there are certain environments that are kind of very tough. Also, the Iberian Peninsula is not so easy to control. Ask any invader that basically tried to conquer it unitarily. And this is a problem, in fact, that even the same Spanish monarchy in the 15th and 16th century, I mean the unified one of Castile and Aragon, definitely didn't overcome. Like Spain, institutionally speaking, was divided. Like at the end of the 15th century was a dynastic union, but the various monarchies remained as such, and their customs remained as such for centuries. So it was actually a mess to administrate this system, and this created definitely problems also in later times for kind of centralizing certain directions and channeling it in a unitary way. This was dramatic because the territory was really huge, right? And there were even political negotiations with the papacy. Thinking about the institution of the Tribunal of Inquisition in Spain, at the end of the 15th century, was basically the only common tribunal to all the Castile and Aragon altogether. Like there was no other unifying institution at that point of all these communities that could legiferate, let's say, at that point. So think about the difficulties and the effort and overall the successful result in relative terms, right? You find Spain that there is a quite precocious level of, for example, developing a bureaucracy that really pertained to this, in fact, kingdom proper. I mean, to the various kingdoms singularly, that was fairly centralized. You don't and quite early in time, as we will see here, this was also kind of beginning in places like Papal Rome and Angevin Naples and Papal Avignon later on. But those powers were the centers of, if you want, a much larger and economically imposing systems. The Iberian Peninsula in this regard was still machinously advancing, yet they set these grounds right at this very moment, and they keep on that track. They go on that track, and this has advantages for them. And after the mid 14th century, the territorial growth has stopped, basically just to restart towards the end, in fact, of the 15th century. This had favored both the importance, even numerical one, of a territorial nobility that could comprehend up to or even beyond the 10% of the population, and the strength of the urban apparatus on the territory. Whether it was recent, like in the case of the Asturias, for example, or whether in the fullest of the mercantile and Mediterranean development, such as in Catalonia, for example. So these common social characteristics were accompanied during the course of the 13th century with the development, especially Catalan and Aragonese, of a royal centrality founded not much over a direct territorial control, right, but rather on the availability of certain coherent central and local administrative structures. Think that this is particularly important because it's really a net of relations. It's not really the direct control, but the capacity in this turmoilous peninsula, let's say, think even about the segmentation of the various crowns, how they are disposed geographically, and how all the interference, the interplay that even came from abroad. Actually, think that, I mean, the 100 Years' War was fought also in the Iberian Peninsula quite harshly, and exactly, taking advantage of these splits, right, of the between the Iberian monarchies that backed either the English or the French. That had different interests in this regard, but initially speaking, this is the astonishing thing. There were, at the beginning of this process, there were large amounts of the Iberian populations that weren't quite framed under the direct control of the monarchy. For example, In 1295, almost 3/4 of the Andalusian territory depended on urban centuries that only that managed it on half of the king, right? So basically, these were areas of a quite developed region of the peninsula that was also very advanced, as we were saying before. That they were under the kingdom of Castile, but they still were pretty autonomous in this regard. They weren't so directly. Think about even the geographical distances in here. It's not easy to control from areas like Toledo, for example, down up to Seville. It's not easy at all, because we're talking about the Middle Ages, and here the political background is all pretty unstable by default, right? So that's the point. It's a power mostly based on deterrence, military deterrence, right? And the Kingdom of Castile is also the strongest in here. So think about it. In the mid 14th century, on the other side, 1/3 of the Catalan-Aragonese population was subdued to local lay seigneurial jurisdictions. So not directly to the king, but to other landlords that were, of course, in contact with the monarchy, and essentially acting in cooperation with it, but not only, right? Sometimes also in competition. So this was a problem, because it was a problem in other areas of, in other times of medieval history. I made, for example, a playlist on Ottonian history, and that is a real problem, because we're talking about several centuries before here. I mean, a couple of centuries before, 4 or 5 centuries before. And that was a situation in which definitely there was no pre-existing state, and these guys managed to create an empire, nominally speaking, exploiting exactly this territorial relations, not managing to control with iron fist actually the majority of the lands they were controlling. Here by the late 13th century, we've seen that the Iberian monarchies already managed actually to control certain areas directly, but still there were large chunks of it that weren't so easily, weren't even accessible so easily. So in spite of the absence of true capital of governments, which is also very important historically speaking, the Iberian monarchies organized certain financial apparatus and also systems of fiscal control, such as the Catalan Mestre Racional and the Treasury, the first registers of which were being true sources of the state, date back to 1297, right? This is very old. This is very important for same documentation of these countries and their functionment. Most European countries didn't have anything like this at this age. They were starting in certain cases, but it was still fairly rare, right? And on the other hand, you see also the progressive juridical unification of each kingdom, right? This is meaningful. The absence of a capital is a problem that was faced also by other polis, but at the time it was fairly normal, right? Here the problem was levying the troops, like managing to impose a minimal authority to have an army in the first place, and therefore to participate into this political and institutional clientele of the monarchy from which others could benefit. But whoever knows Iberian history of the time knows how conflictual this whole thing was, and this is probably also what accelerated the picture. I don't know how much the militarization of the Reconquista partly favored this phenomenon. Surely this is pretty evident in Castile especially. That was in fact the most robust political and military power already by default. I mean, as forms also of political, of territorial domination. Say that there was a pretty consistent continuity in quite large areas, but still that wasn't it. There were other noblemen, there were other communities that basically could still shift the balance, in maybe not in favor of the monarchy. Yet the necessity of a monarchy here is for everybody. Like every side, every political faction realizes that, yeah, it's not that we are fighting the monarchy as such most of the times. We're simply defending, yes, our customs that are generally free. In the Middle Ages was normal. The monarchy had the only function to preserve and defend the local customs, juridically speaking. That's it. The idea was self-government everywhere, but that definitely was not a fight against the institution per se, but rather backing certain elements that could definitely participate to power, and from which this coming from the communities that hope to benefit from it, right? So naturally everybody dislikes the monarchy up to the point you don't have the chance to become the monarchy yourself. So this is naturally what happens in many other countries and all over the world, we could say. And here it takes a quite fortunate and an effective direction, at least. For example, in Castile, Alfonso X and his entourage launched between the 50s and the 80s of the 13th century this great work of juridical systematization, quite famous. Alfonso the Wise, who was known as. This work was known as the Las Siete Partidas, which were essentially the 7 parts, literally, that constitute this attempt from the side of monarchic power to surpass the common legislation of the local customary law, the fueros in Spanish. This is what it was. The fuero is fuero is singular, fueros is plural. Is this broader juridical concept for which it could be actually a lot of things in the same place. It could be the same tribunal sometimes, but it's basically it means a compilation of laws, especially at the regional level. So from areas that actually had also their own specific identities already, right? Albeit they were still laws that were specifically referred to certain identified classes or estates, right? So, for example, it was the fuero militar that was comparable to the military code of justice, the ecclesiastical ones that was specific to the Roman Catholic Church in Spain. So it's complicated, but still it embodied essentially also certain, not just political or social prerogatives, but actually also some certain identity territorial ones that were forming in this point, because the Iberian Peninsula definitely had its own pre-existing identities that had formed over time, and on the base of which roughly the same Iberian monarchies had taken shape, right? So Las Siete Partidas were retaken eventually and completed in the first half of the 14th century. So this thing went on in Castile, while in Catalonia-Aragon you see instead the Cortes, right? So the parliaments proper to obtain various general privileges. The first one, in absolute terms, was the Aragonese one of 1283. So at the same time, the royal presence on the territory was delegated to officers such as the Merinos, the Adelantados in Castile, and the Butlers in Catalonia. The Merinos were essentially administrators of justice. The Adelantados were mostly, about the tax collection, right? They pushed for those who were unwilling to be taxed in some ways. The Butlers in Catalonia were fundamentally similar institutions, but you understand that this has to do chiefly with two things: the exercising of justice and tax levies, right? This is the tax collection. This is the most important aspect of the story. Importance of law that we often disregard, saying, it's all about military power. Yes, but military power passes through the resources that you can levy, sometimes even through the administration of justice. Being like in this completely troubled situation that you can find, the idea of a central power, of a public authority that can settle matters and to bring order and stability is very important. And if you are already powerful enough to be recognized with your political and military clienteles as someone capable of doing that, definitely you can start saying, you need me to stay here to solve your matters, to confirm your rights, to legitimize your own prerogatives, right? Because this was the main problem that eventually the Middle Ages did not surpass, if not very timidly in very, very few exceptions. But essentially you have to come up to the late modern age before finding a state that is a monarchy, if we really want to be precise, that manages to progressively buy these local prerogatives in exchange for essentially the elimination of the same fiscal burdens. For example, the one of the army, that was definitely the most consistent here. So here it was already enough essentially to work progressively on the elites to make them become locally more elites, so making them achieve a superior status at a local level, but still tying them to the monarchic authority as such, because otherwise they would have lost those prerogatives. And this was something that throughout the 14th and 15th century happened basically throughout all over Europe. The meaningful thing here is it is done within the frame of a monarchic institution that is developing kind of central apparatuses that are going to remain over the long run. It makes a lot of differences. There were areas in Europe here that were definitely more advanced than the Iberian Peninsula, but that lacked, for example, a monarchy, a central monarchy, and this will become a disadvantage, because actually in the early modern age these areas will be overrun fundamentally, simply because they couldn't channel their political and military resources as the Iberian kingdoms instead could. So the importance of the state here is really, really important, right? And every modernist will say, oh, this was not a real state, everything was decentralized. Well, doesn't mean anything. There is always a certain degree of centralization. And what is important here is to spot that, of course, this was getting stronger and stronger in the last 2 centuries of the Middle Ages, but even from the 13th century, telling the truth, to evolve into what would become is known as the modern state, which also basically doesn't mean much, because between the customary laws in a monarchy as a protector of them and the state as sole source of law, like with in the Napoleonic era, there is really no real stage in the middle ground. You can find this progressive centralization, but yes, it's always a matter of centralization, but it's never full centralization. So actually, great part of the modern state is nothing but the continuation of a medieval state, even in its centralization, as a general track, right? Then the forms change, but the substance does not, right? If not quantitatively speaking. So on the other hand, we see that the governmental choices of the Iberian monarchies were often determined by the political interventions of the nobility and of the urban elites. So, of course, the monarchy was strengthening itself thanks to this aristocracy, but still the latter had a lot to say about monarchic affairs, because they were effectively more than in other countries, specifically France and England, more to say what the monarchy could do and could not do. Maybe not in Castile. Castile had a fair, degree of obedience. Definitely in Aragon, I think was more complicated. But still, what is important here is that without a pre-existing statal domination, you still need these people to rule in the first place. So in instrument was more used by the nobility to intervene in monarchic affairs was definitely the one of representative assemblies, the Cortes that we've mentioned before. In this Cortes, the clergy, the nobility, and the urban delegates gathered, and between the 13th and the 14th century, there was such a strong development in the bond between the monarchy with its officials and the social nobility or urban elites, right, that basically allowed, in parallel to the development of the same monarchy, also an evident increase in the territorial and urban autonomies in many ways. This because these two groups, let's say, were in constant competition one with the other. The monarchy and the aristocracy backed each other constantly, as much as they stabbed each other at their backs all the time. It was a constant negotiation between the monarchy and the Cortes. In Castile, this, for example, produced the creation of certain urban leagues, the brotherhoods or hermandades in Spanish, that intervened with decision within the government of the kingdom. From its size, from the increased importance of the Catalan-Aragonese Cortes, that were the guardians of the various regional customs, contributed to the proliferation of competitive political centers towards the monarchy. In a certain sense, for every sub-kingdom, as we can see in the one of the Kingdom of Aragon, there is Aragon, Catalonia, Valencia, and Mallorca, that all had their own dimension. In many ways, it could be pretty significantly differing. There was the formalization of every local custom, which created certain particular relations, also from an administrative point of view, with a tendentially confederate monarchy, right? On the other hand, the elites of the various regional societies, so we're talking essentially about the Aragonese nobility and the Catalan urban elites, because these were the major powers. That Aragon is largely kind of it's about livestock and typical kind of feudal background. Catalonia is urbanized, is heavily involved in trade towards the Mediterranean. So they're very different communities, even fairly close geographically, right? So this is important. Well, these groups obliged the royal authority to institutionalize, for example, through the general privileges, their own milieu of political and territorial autonomy, beginning, therefore, a system of, let's say, governmental, of factional government, we could say, which is based on this close cooperation, which could be also definitely conflictual, between the monarchy and local powers, which means that everything the monarchy had to do, the local Cortes had their own say in the thing, and this naturally brought to an accentuated difficulty in centralizing power. So on similar bases started during the 14th and the 15th century, certain developments that differed from kingdom to kingdom, albeit on this common background, let's say, of growth of royal service. Castile, as for many ways, even Portugal, orientated itself towards a kind of political dualism between the monarchy and the nobility, including in the latter the urban one. In Navarre, the dynasty of the Évroes favored, since 1328, this process of political construction on the base of the French model, which included the formation of a court of auditors, and royal control of the social hierarchies through the monopolium of the nobilitations that ever more were ever more favoring the royal officials, right? So this is also a pretty interesting game, as this was imported from France, where the monarchy was already much more robust. Naturally, Navarre is much smaller, but the idea that essentially there is a more central orientation. Navarre naturally has a particular environment that also favors this largely, right? A greater centralization, and that is possible also because of this, say, cooptation of royal officials in the nobility. So these were people who not only were backing the monarchy, receiving legitimization in exchange, but they were essentially people who had been working from within the monarchy since the beginning. This is very important, especially when you're building a new state, because it really means to be from that side, to be by default in the clientele of the monarchy. Naturally, there were problems also with these officials on the long run, but still it was a way more effective way to keep everything together than what happened in the larger, also by the way, Castile and Aragon, that they were definitely much more difficult to control, and that's why also they produced more astonishingly successful structures in this regard. It's really difficult to manage a larger country than a smaller one. It's really a physical problem. Really, a lot more of energies go wasted by default. And in Catalonia, instead, the political, diplomatic, and military action of the crown led to this brilliant Mediterranean expansion that was not supported, however, by the development of a similar internal unity of government, and that therefore, however, suffered on the long period of the absence of a stable administrative and fiscal centralization. Right, Aragon had a huge potential in this regard, but exactly because of its potential, it kind of trampled a monarchical authority in many ways. Traditionally, for the history of 14th century Castile, it's been emphasized this great political break determined by the civil war of the 60s, opened by the rebellion of Henry, Count of Trastamara, against the king, Peter IV, the Cruel, nicknamed Cruel. The victory of Henry in 1369 was also the one of the forces that had backed him, and especially the great territorial aristocracy, but also the one of the same court and of the high ecclesiastical hierarchies. And in reality, the political structures didn't undergo, for this very reason, such deep transformations. Of course, the first half of the 14th century had reinforced the royal predominion over the Castilian society, a society that, by the way, was ever more hegemonized by an aristocratic model, created exactly also by the urban elites. For example, think about the caballeros villanos, the system of values of which was pretty close actually to one of the lower nobility of the hidalgos themselves, right? So there had been an homogenization, and it happened as it happened in other European countries, when you see this important rise of the urban elites towards the 13th century that eventually get aristocratized, they get feudalized in some measure, right? Especially from a cultural point of view, right? Of course, they remain elites. They deal with money, with trade. Their world is the city, but of course they start expanding in the countryside. But especially they start being framed, in this case, under a real central institution to which they participate and to which they tie their own community to. So part of the process of oligarchic aristocratization of the urban elites was expressed also in the royal concession and royal grant of fiscal exemption that up to that point had been the prerogative of the nobility. So also in here you find that there is the attempt to increase the control over the kingdom by the monarchy through elements that were traditionally not part of the old nobility. And in this context, the royal control was manifested at its best exactly in the urban environment, in the urban milieu, through the suppression of the hermandades from the side of Alfonso XI that made a considerable effort to also unify the various sources of law with the famous Ordinamiento de Alcalá, which is a collection of 58 laws enacted by the court of Alfonso in Alcalá de Henares in 1348. These laws are an important part of the principal legislative body of the Castilian crown during the Low Middle Ages until the Leyes de Toro emanated in 1505. So there was also this great effort, always from Alfonso XI, to reform also the urban magistracies through the royal appointment of the so-called corregidores that were entrusted with the government, the urban government. So this is even more poignant, because you see that in Castile, the monarchy is able even to impose its own policy on urban centers that traditionally were the ones that were kind of more difficult to frame under direct control, in that in Aragon had basically brought to this progressive, emancipation, if you want, even from the monarchy. So two different trends in this regard. This was difficult also in other European contexts here. They don't think that subduing a city was so easy. And here you even have the direct control of a royal appointee, which is all the more meaningful than just, cooperating with the local elite that still negotiates with you. Here you can't even place people that, of course, have to be appreciated by a certain degree by the local elites, but still are your guys, right? So it's very meaningful. So these attempts of monarchical centralization were favored especially by the growth of a administrative personnel formed especially by universitary jurists, the so-called letrados, so the literates. Hence the importance of university for monarchic power, the foundations, the evolution of previous centers of culture. Think about the same Toledo that effectively was the main center of Castile, albeit there is not really the concept of permanent capital here at this point. But Toledo had been the most famous school of translation in the West that had this very ancient studium. Since Muslim times, eventually the Christians developed it further. So this was very important for, even this is a matter of pointing out what the prerogatives of the monarchy was, and this could pass through the juridical studies that for people that were required a very great competence and education in juridical matters. On the other side, you have in this constant iron arm with the local aristocracy, this continuous statutory and fiscal activity of the Cortes, right? That seemed at that point to brusquely slow down with the arrival of the Trastamara, initially speaking, though. So the dynastic renewal coincided at this point with the development of the so-called estados, which means essentially this wide territories that comprehended also urban settlements and that were directly dependent on the major aristocratic lineages, right? So there is a compaction of territorial dominations, not just at a monarchic level, but also at a private level in some cases. that's where the elites try to have a dialogue, and yet society basically gets stratified in the process. So the renewed political and territorial relevance of the nobility or elite, exemplified by the strong increase in the 15th century of the seigneurial fortifications, for example, was not translated, however, into the formation of politically autonomous principates. The Trastamara nobility was, in fact, a new and open aristocracy that was also very conflictual within itself, right? There was the development of the so-called bandas, that were aristocratic factions that could count on this personal clientele of the criados, that were often recruited from the lesser nobility. And that was also updated by the social rise of the letrados. This is very important because you see that at this point the nobility in Castile, at least, doesn't feel quite much as just a concurrent to monarchic power per se, as we were saying before, but rather a competitor that could essentially create a small, a milieu of power on its own, to that somewhat resembled, also with means of clienterly administration and education of the officials, etc., the same monarchy to which they hope to access to, and this the conflictuality within the same nobility is the proof that it was a competition for the monarchy itself. So the problem was not the king. These guys were fine with that. They realized that their power was too great to be crushed by the monarchy as such. But what they were trying to do was essentially to compete, to basically knock out each other and prevaricate each other and create, reach, the court, reach the this ultra, the highest level of political power, increasing their own assets at that point. So in this, the political supremacy depended also on the favor of the Trastamara dynasty, that on about the end of the 14th century, let's say, had started this redefinition in a specialistic sense of the central apparatuses. For example, they had developed the audiencia, so this possibility of naturally accessing more directly to the monarch and having therefore a debate at a high political level, the court of auditors, and the chancery. And also the royal council was enhanced at this time. So during this period you find the delineation of a new political balance between the monarchy and the nobility, always including the urban oligarchies. This is important to bear in mind. It was founded both on administrative relations between the aristocracies and the court, let's say, and on the development of more formal bonds, let's say, centered on the relations of force within the court itself. So in fact it's the court that with its favorites, the so-called privados, right, began in Castile and in Portugal of the new dynasty of the Aves that had risen in 1385, the place per excellence of the resolution of political conflict, while the renewed political weight of the territorial and oligarchic elites did not impede their own employment as instruments of centralization of monarchic power. So in many ways Castile and Portugal see this achievement in framing the nobility under monarchic direction, largely, right? This is a very important direction, and it's not important much the actual accomplishment. The actual stability naturally remained fairly troubled, but what is important here is that these are the most powerful people of the kingdom, and they're under your control. They depend on you in a way or another. You depend on them partially too, but they're not secessionists. They're not people who can create another polity. In many ways, there are other countries in Europe, even France. Think about the Bourbon in France during the 16th century. We would give problems in this regard. They were essentially states within the state. Spain, it's different in this regard. Especially Castile has this ability to, and Portugal, to maintain this continuity in the institutions and political and territorial dominations. Let's say. For what concerns instead the Catalonia-Aragonese Confederation, the process of statal construction took partially different directions that were determined, by the way, by a originally more composite character of such political formation, as we have seen that beyond strong concentrations of aristocratic power counted on one of the major commercial cities of the Mediterranean, Barcelona. The Cortes in the Kingdom of Aragon, as this body of representatives, both of the Aragonese nobility and of the Catalonian city elites, maintained and, on the contrary, strengthened their own capacity of intervention over the government through the institution of the of a permanent delegation of financial control, right? Financial and administrative control, actually, known as the Disputación del General, so the general disputation, that was developed in Catalonia since 1359, and that was soon imitated also by Aragon and Valencia. Furthermore, the maintenance of juridical customs and administrative structures proper of every political entity of the Confederacy favored the growth of kind of regional proto-nationalisms in some ways. For example, you find the creation of an office of Mestre Racional at Valencia at the end of the 14th century. But there are other examples. For example, the same fueros of Aragon of 1370 demanded a local recruitment of all the officials that did not have to come from, quote, any other nation. Right, this is very important because these guys essentially weren't open to any form of centralization, not even in the the mission, as we've seen in Castile, of royal functionaries of every sort. So these guys wanted to be ruled simply by the local elite. Point. It was obviously the same elite that controlled the fueros in this regard, this is important on at the level of creation of a local political continuity compared to a kind of super regional, super provincial. I don't know what term is better here, but it's definitely meaningful because you see essentially the failure of a process of centralization, and in fact, the political centralization was so limited and for so long for the Aragonese crown that, by the way, in those centuries had managed, in fact, to build its diplomatic financial supremacy over large part of the Western Mediterranean. So what is fascinating of it is that this system was also somewhat functional, right? Because it had managed to still put something together. There were definitely lots of assets that depended on the fortune of, say, on the same crown in some ways. There were, the crown was financed by these same communities, so there was a continuity in this regard, but still it was largely a matter, in fact, of local support that had all the interest for this expansion, especially from Catalonia, I imagine, right? It was by far the richest land in this context. So, on the other hand, we can't, not to take into consideration the dynastic crisis in this picture that were definitely one of the major problems of every let's say of pre-contemporary state, we could say. I mean, as long as this was a government tied to the continuity of a dynasty and that determined the same political stability of the kingdom, this was a real weakness overall. Some of the greatest changes in historical events of the time were due to dynastic problems. But even positively speaking, think about the same union of Castile and Aragon. Think about the Habsburgic marriage at the same time. This changed literally the history of Europe forever. But at the same time, at the local level, they brought to this difficulty, and naturally they pushed, however, because there is always this kind of dual effort towards the need of some kind of gluing, right, of all the system, because naturally it was very advantageous at this point to be a powerful competitor in Europe overall. So, without hiding the differences in the process of statal construction in Castile and in Catalonia-Aragon, at this point we have to observe the links, let's say, of essentially dynastic nature, and also the strategical convergences that would exercise this deep role would have had this deep role in the 15th century and eventually modern political physiognomy of the Iberian Peninsula. The dynastic crises that troubled it during in very few decades, actually, albeit in different ways. The life of Castile and Aragon, for example, saw the full commitment, let's say, involvement of both the crowns and of both the aristocracies. So you see here that still there was this internal clash within the same Iberian monarchies that didn't have much to, they had all the interest naturally also for the others, constantly weakening each other and trying to prevail. There were several wars here, and we still don't arrive to make a political military history of this all. But it's important, for example, this event, this event that is fully international, that is intertwined with the episodes of the 100 Years' War, this bloody dynastic exchange in Castile of 1369, that saw the contribution that Peter IV of Aragon, for example, gave to Henry of Trastamare. At this point was established a connection that 40 years later would have had consequences within the context of another dynastic passing. Let's say the one happened in 1410 when Martin I, that was also king of Sicily and Aragon, died without heirs. During the interregnum, emerged in a member of the same Castilian royal family, Ferdinand of Trastamare, that was elected at the Compromise of Caspe of 1412, and this was important because he was a candidate that was fundamentally an outsider to the aristocratic Catalan and Aragonese world, who was an external candidate to the Catalonian-Aragonese high aristocratic world, let's say. So this is meaningful because there was also the sense of finding a solution that could really make things work at the end of the day, which is very important in politics. We often forget about negotiation as such. So the deep differentiation in late medieval evolution of the Castilian and Catalan-Aragonese politics and society in the process of formation of their monarchies were not cancelled for this, right? However, the strategical convergences of the policies of the two crowns characterized strongly the international action of the Iberian Peninsula, especially during the development of the Mediterranean and Italian policy at the time of Alfonso the Magnanimous between 1416 and 1458. This was actually a commitment of perfectly Catalan character, to which the Castilian administrators and noblemen were not, however, extraneous from. And furthermore, the weight of the dynastic plots, let's say, was felt deeply at the time of John II of Castile, 1406-1454, whose reign was conditioned first by the regent Ferdinand of Antequera, who was King of Navarre and later on actually King of Aragon, and that was for a long time the arbiter of the Castilian policy, and eventually by his son Alfonso V. So, on the other hand, the long absence of the same Alfonso that was committed in the first in the conquest and eventually in the government of the Kingdom of Naples caused the serious political unbalances in Catalonia that after his death degenerated in a real civil war between 1462 and 1472 that also invested the Castilian kingdom. In one or another, the matrimonial tie that in 1469 united Isabel, sister of Charles IV of Castile and heirs to the throne, to Ferdinand, heir of John of Aragon, could therefore confirm the deep reasons of the tendency to a meeting ground between the two major Iberian monarchical traditions that was ever more stable. So from this marriage, as we know, there would have come in 1479 the final unification under Ferdinand of the two crowns, right? The two things were distinguished as long as, and they would remain political at a local level. Always remember this: there was no kingdom of Spain as such, right? The two kingdoms remained split, and with all their local institutions. So the differences remained, and the differences that would have been highlighted when at the end of the Middle Ages the would have the Atlantic vocation, we can say, would have taken place, right? This invested the Spanish crown, and in some ways it was very opposed to the traditional Mediterranean action of the Catalonian kings. And in spite of this, in spite of the, let's say, the maintenance of strong regional specificities, the strategical choices entailed everywhere the capacity to rationalize the governmental structures and the evolution of the relations of balance of strength between a monarchy characterized in general by this ever more centralizing tendencies and the capacity of a political intervention of the various elites, territorial or urban alike, coming from the ancient seigneurial aristocracy, the old seigneurial aristocracy, but also from the younger urban oligarchies, or even from the new nobility of the same letrados. So the same literates who had, had a success, had made a career within the royal or even nobiliar power many times. So it's a very complicated picture that is difficult to be concise about, because you realize that here we haven't really discussed all the enormous difficulties that this process really entailed. Like, history could take another path, but at the same time we cannot ignore the political will, the realization that a compaction of power was possible, that even if especially in Catalonia and Aragon, the monarchy had this kind of very dependent power on the local institution. Still, there was a comprehensive direction that could be taken for at the benefit of the same group of the same kingdom and beyond, right? Because at this point, objectively, the Spanish had common interests, and in Europe especially, and this was perfectly showed by the success that Spain would have in the early modern age in its intervention in Italy, and its broader, its eventual commitment elsewhere. In this kind of, we can't speak of a hegemonic role, but definitely was the major power in Europe, and this came from a country that is still internally had remained still divided. So this, as we were saying before, this would create problems, right? There was a formal division. It wasn't just like, it was formal and factual in many ways, but at the same time there was a kind of agreement on the necessity to stick together and to support broadly the monarchic direction, the ruling dynasty, and for the advantage of the whole system. And that what would happen later is another story. And I think we should talk more about the Iberian Peninsula, because we haven't done it very much. And I think that these videos are so kind of theoretical at some point that it's difficult to follow the track. But if you want to really look at the histories of all these various monarchs, for now, even Wikipedia goes well, right? What demonizes Wikipedia has problems, because objectively, from a historical point of view, the English one is pretty fine, right? If you really want to know concisely what we're talking about, it's really obvious, right? I can't explain every single step here, but at one point we will have to go a bit deeper in the technicalities of how this practically happened, and it's that highlight the merit that these political entities had in creating something more robust, more common, right, more cooperative, that I think at the end of the day, from a an historical perspective, is a controversial topic, because naturally there are many factors involved. First of all is that we do really need a strong government or not, and even in presence of a strong government, do we need the local autonomies, at which level, right? It's not a matter of saying yes or no. It's the answer is all the time, historically speaking, in which measure, right? And I'm not saying that this process effectively created necessarily more, let's say that the average person, well, probably could have been benefited overall, because still the system went on. Like, it didn't crumble in itself. There were certain strengths that were uniquely channeled at one point, and yes, it was still kind of ancien regime context, but at the same time, the same Spain came to produce at this point a very important amount of cultural production, of juridical thinking, of innovation. I mean, there is no let's say there is no sharp division between what a political direction can produce and what can another, because at the same time it seems like there are certain forces that will head towards one direction anyway, if it is really convenient. Naturally, political differences can make an enormous differences, but it's also about the external direction of this, right? Think about, I don't know, what would happen to the Spanish in the 80 Years' War. I mean, that is seen as especially the beginnings, were probably being managed in a very different way. But at that point we're still talking about a system that had a political autonomy of enormous reach. I mean, a political action of enormous. They could afford to reason even in those terms, and this was the result of what Spain had managed to come, like to be, right? Think about the same Portugal that we have neglected in here. I mean, these guys created an enormous empire. Geographically speaking, yeah, they also, it didn't last particularly long. Eventually, it kind of was, it crumbled, but the Spanish could have backed it economically. But let's say that's another story. We're talking about the early modern age. But just for saying that this process of political compaction, let's put it in this way, it's not even, it's also a matter of centralization, because centralization does fluidify the way organization works, right? But it's really about this common consensus that brought, in a way or another, to eventually expand and to make these countries better than they were before. It was a tremendous improvement in living conditions overall, from when we started the 13th century into the 16th, and this is brought by many aspects, but at the same time it's also a matter of rationalizing government, or having a more functional and homogeneous system of administration, right? And yet this is interesting, came from different backgrounds that were convinced of the goodness of their prerogatives. And this is perhaps also controversial, because that would create a problem at the end of the day. These prerogatives made the governability of the system more difficult, right? And we live in times in which these problems will probably be discussed a lot in the near future, because there are objectively situations in which you can't fundamentally just say, well, okay, the more freedom, the better it is in absolute terms. It doesn't always happen like that, right? So we have to look at the limits of this, and thinking of liberty rather than freedom as a general thinking. But these are things that are always debated at the end of the day, and that produced, in fact, some of the most atrocious conflicts. And that, once again, that is also meaningful. All resources that were destroyed essentially for the lack of a common intent, right? And naturally, this happens in turn when there are effective interests, right? It's like the Aragonese in here. Well, these guys were making a freaking lot of money from Catalonia especially. Of course they didn't want to give that up. They did but they were expanding on their own. I mean, I suspect that the Catalonian government in itself was much more advanced in many ways, much more developed civilly. I don't know, specifically the Aragonese one, because think about just the volume of traffics that they had at that point. I mean, they were much closer to, I don't know, an Italian city republic than to a feudal institution. So we know that civilization started from there. Think about the cartography at this point between Barcelona and Genoa or Pisa. At this point, these guys were really creating the maps that we, the cartographic science that we still use, right? The first steps were made in this regard. So it's always a matter of balance of strengths, and it often gets down simply to that. But this is just my reflection. Anyhow, so I think we can stop here for now. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.